Вы умеете прощать?
Да. Но не все.
А что невозможно простить?
Предательство.
In a high-stakes battle for power, the Wagner Group's rise to supremacy threatens to plunge the Russian Federation into a devastating civil war. As President Putin's grip on authority wavers, the notorious private military company wages a dangerous campaign against the Russian army, setting the stage for a catastrophic showdown. Will the fractured forces tear the nation apart, or can they find a way to unite against the impending chaos? Let's find out. Little did Putin realize that he was sowing the seeds of his own downfall. Wagner Group rapidly transformed from a small, light infantry force into a formidable army, surpassing the regular Russian military in capabilities, as acknowledged by Ukrainian sources. Wagner not only had its own heavy equipment, including tanks, artillery, air defenses, and helicopters, but it also owned lucrative mines in Africa, making it financially self-sufficient and independent of the Russian government. This newfound independence would prove to be Vladimir Putin's undoing. The Battle of Bakhmut became the catalyst for Russia's internal crisis, rivaling the magnitude of the fall of the Soviet Union. Witnessing the Russian Federation's willingness to endure heavy casualties for its capture, Ukraine seized the opportunity to turn Bakhmut into a focal point of the entire war. Desperate for a victory after the stunning Ukrainian counterattack, the Russian army, under Putin's direction, sought to claim an ideological triumph. Surprisingly, Bakhmut became the symbol of this desired triumph, despite the significant casualty disparity and the mounting costs. Amidst this bloody struggle, Prigozhin, realizing the dire situation, attempted to strike a deal with Ukrainian intelligence. Allegedly, he offered the precise locations and dispositions of nearby Russian units in exchange for the surrender of Bakhmut, which would have allowed Ukraine to launch devastating attacks on the Russian regular army. However, Ukraine saw more value in retaining control over Bakhmut. They believed that Prigozhin's intelligence was not significantly superior to the information they already received from Western intelligence agencies, particularly the United States. Consequently, the battle for Bakhmut continued. The rivalry between Wagner and the Russian army had been simmering for some time. Incidents of sabotage and clashes between the two factions had created a toxic atmosphere. Dictators like Putin often foster such rivalries among subordinates to prevent them from uniting against him. This internal rivalry, while keeping Putin safe from Wagner's insurrection, severely compromised Russia's military competence in the war against the smaller, less equipped Ukrainian forces. The Ukrainian forces capitalized on the discord between Wagner and the Russian army, benefiting from their lack of coordination and information sharing. During the Battle of Volodar, all three factions, the Russian army, Wagner, and the Patriot PMC, refused to cooperate, leading to devastating ambushes and the destruction of numerous Russian armored vehicles. As Ukraine gradually pushed back the Russians in Bakhmut, tensions between Prigozhin and the Russian Ministry of Defense escalated. Both sides sought the glory of capturing Bakhmut, despite the immense casualties and the campaign's prolonged duration. As Wagner approached the outskirts of the town, the Russian army attempted a pincer attack to beat them there. Furious with the Russian army, Prigozhin accused them of deliberately denying his troops the necessary ammunition to conclude the fight. Prigozhin orchestrated a theatrical display to garner sympathy and support. He released emotional and staged videos, berating the Ministry of Defense in front of dead Russian soldiers. However, it has been revealed that Prigozhin's show was part of a larger scheme. American intelligence uncovered evidence suggesting that Wagner was not facing an ammo shortage, but rather they were feigning it. Prigozhin had secretly been stockpiling supplies in rear areas near the Russian border, likely in preparation for his coup. Prigozhin claimed that the Russian army had shelled one of his camps, resulting in casualties. However, video evidence raised doubts about the scale of the alleged attack. Prigozhin used this incident as a pretext for what he called a march for justice, an invasion of Russia framed as a righteous cause. Wagner forces crossed into Russia from multiple points and headed towards Rostov-on-Don, the headquarters of the Southern Military District. Russian forces sent to impede Wagner's advance allegedly allowed them to pass unhindered. Upon reaching Rostov-on-Don, Wagner surrounded key buildings, including the Municipal Center, the FSB headquarters, and the Southern Military District headquarters. Prigozhin's forces then marched north and swiftly captured the major city of Voronezh, along with its military installations. While sporadic clashes with Russian forces occurred, Wagner Wagner's advance seemed unstoppable. The scarcity of visible Russian military deployments in response to the coup became apparent as Moscow scrambled to fortify its defenses. Social media footage revealed an overwhelming presence of Wagner's armored vehicles, including tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, air defense systems, and artillery, far surpassing any visible Russian army response. These events mark a critical turning point in Russia's internal crisis, with Prigozhin's forces gaining momentum and posing a severe threat to Putin's regime. The situation remains fluid, and further details will undoubtedly emerge, shedding more light on the unfolding events. Wagner had a clear advantage over the Russian army in terms of firepower and resources, as indicated by all the available information at the time. The Russian military's focus on Ukraine had depleted its reserves, making it vulnerable to an invasion on its own soil. This raises the question of what would happen if Ukraine were to initiate a similar move. Although Wagner held a significant advantage over the Russian army, there was no political support for Prigozhin, which may have influenced his decision to cancel his march on Moscow. After negotiations with Belarus's Lukashenko, Prigozhin announced the end of his coup attempt and ordered the Wagner forces back to their field camps. In return, both Wagner and Prigozhin received a blanket pardon from Vladimir Putin, and Prigozhin was allowed to leave Russia for Belarus. The motivations behind Prigozhin's short-lived coup and its abrupt end remain uncertain. However, we can speculate based on the information available. It became apparent within the first 24 hours that while Prigozhin lacked political support, he enjoyed significant popular support wherever Wagner traveled. Upon the announcement of the coup's end, large crowds gathered in Rostov-on-Don, cheering on Wagner and chanting Prigozhin's name. There were also credible reports of Russian army units refusing to engage Wagner, with a few soldiers even joining his cause. However, the government's strict control over social media and the internet made it difficult to observe this wave of popular support from within Russia. Prigozhin may not have been aware of the extent of the cheering crowds in Rostov-on-Don or his growing popularity on social media. Prior to the coup, Prigozhin and Wagner were not widely known to most Russians due to media restrictions aimed at portraying the Russian army as heroes while suppressing any mention of Prigozhin or Wagner. The surge in Prigozhin's popularity since the coup could have influenced his decision-making. Had he been aware of his increasing support, he might have continued his march on Moscow. However, without political backing for Wagner, it would have been challenging for Prigozhin to establish a credible new government, even if he had successfully taken Moscow and forced Putin into exile. Alternatively, Prigozhin may have never intended to overthrow Putin. He might have become aware of the treason case being built against him by the FSB and other Russian legal agencies. Sergei Shoigu, in particular, had a strong motivation to eliminate Prigozhin as a rival and could have used the legal apparatus to do so. Prigozhin's actions, which were seen as seditious or challenging to Putin's power, could have prompted him to see armed insurrection as his only option. Recognizing the weakness of the Russian army, he might have calculated that getting close to Moscow would force Putin into pardoning him. This would have been a calculated risk, explaining why Wagner chose to launch attacks both south towards Rostov-on-Don from the Ukrainian border and north towards Moscow, instead of massing for a single thrust northwards. Capturing cities like Rostov-on-Don and Voronezh, which held strategic importance, would have greatly unsettled Putin and disrupted the war effort. Moreover, if Prigozhin had intended to launch a coup, he could have coordinated better with Russian partisan forces, such as the Russian Volunteer Corps and the Freedom of Russia Legion, which would have caused further disarray in the government and military. The fact that Prigozhin never broadcasted his messages over regular Russian media, despite capturing major cities, suggests that he was not serious about removing Putin from power. Wagner and Prigozhin faced severe restrictions on their social media channels, and Russian media had been prohibited from mentioning them for weeks. Even during President Putin's address to the nation, he never mentioned Prigozhin or Wagner by name. If Prigozhin had truly intended to stage a coup, it would be peculiar for him not to make his case through traditional media outlets in cities like Rostov-on-Don and Voronezh, which were under his control. Another theory is that Putin and Prigozhin orchestrated the entire coup to shift blame for the failing war onto Sergei Shoigu and General Gerasimov. Prigozhin consistently blamed the Ministry of Defense for misleading the president about the war, even accusing them of fabricating claims of Ukraine or NATO preparing to attack Russia. Prigozhin never mentioned removing Putin and reiterated his loyalty to the presidency. However, the lack of action against Shoigu and Gerasimov and Putin's apparent intent to continue the war make this theory increasingly unlikely. The truth behind and Prigozhin's coup may take time to emerge, along with other secrets of this war. Given the incompetence displayed by the modern Russian Federation, it is difficult to predict any theory with certainty. At this point, one might even consider the possibility that Prigozhin inadvertently led Wagner in the wrong direction, and upon realizing they were invading Russia, decided to proceed to save face and take their chances rather than facing embarrassment. Regardless, the only beneficiary of this chaos is Ukraine. Many pro-revolution activists contributed by inundating Russian media channels with calls for civil war and memes. When history recounts this war, it will acknowledge the efforts of those who fought for freedom by using every means available.